Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody joining us for this afternoon's session. I'm Glenn Morris. I'm the director of the Emerging Pathogens Institute. And again, we're really pleased to have you. It's been a good morning. For those of you who have not made it to the poster sessions, I would strongly encourage you to do so. I think we've got some great posters up, and the posters will remain up through, well, at least for the immediate future. So if you want your mother to see your poster, we can probably arrange something whereby we can get her access and let her take a look at what you've got up there. So again, if you haven't seen the posters, please go by. They're easy to look at, and it's nice to flip through and see what you've got there. For our first talk this afternoon, we are very pleased to have Professor Grant Stinterford. Dr. Stinterford is Healthy Food Seafood Theme Lead at Cfas and head of the OIE Collaborating Center for Emerging Aquatic Animal Diseases, co-director of the Sustainable Aquaculture Future Center at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. He was director of the European Union Reference Laboratory for Crustacean Diseases on behalf of DG Sanko of the European Commission between 2008 and 2018, and science lead for the aquatic animal health at Cfas from 2016 to 2019. He has a Ph.D. in invertebrate pathology from the University of Glasgow. He is a pathologist and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Pathology in 2014 and a Fellow of the Linnean Society in 2016. His work focuses on the identification and impact of aquatic animal diseases in farmed and wild environments. He has led the development of the One Health aquaculture and all hazards concepts within Cfas, building these in UK and overseas program work. He will speak today on sustainable aquaculture through the One Health lens. I would note that unfortunately, because of some glitches in terms of timing, this is not a live performance by Professor Stentiford. What we have is a recording. It's a good recording, although he sometimes gets a little blurry down at the bottom corner. Our apologies for some of the technical lapses. What I will say is that since he's not on live streaming, we're not going to be able to take live questions. But if you do have a question, then just simply enter them in the question box, and it will give you an opportunity to ask a question, and we will make certain that Dr. Stentiford receives all of the questions, and we will ask him to respond to them. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Stentiford.
Hello, I'm Grant. I'm Healthy Seafood Theme Lead at Cfas in the UK, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the One Health approach to aquaculture that we've been looking to develop over the last few years. I'm a pathologist at Cfas, and I spend my time over the last number of years working in situations like the one you see on the slide here. These are people trying to clear out a so-called emergency harvest from a shrimp farm, in this case in Thailand, where the shrimp farm has been hit with an important disease called yellowhead virus, and these people are trying to salvage some of the stock before the whole pond dies. So it gives a good example of in aquaculture where you can get some pretty extreme effects of disease and health impacting yield and profit for these farmers. I'm talking a little bit about how we're looking to sort of manage and control some of those risks in aquaculture. So who are Cfas? Well, Cfas are part of UK government, and we're a specific agency of Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs. We've got 2 big laboratories and a research vessel. About 600 staff or so work there, and we're really the lead advisors and evidence gatherers on marine science for the UK government. We're set up as 4 major themes of work with some of my colleagues here. Some of you may know, leading up those areas, and I lead up a theme called Healthy Seafood, one of the 4 blocks of Cfas. The Healthy Seafood theme itself has got 2 international centres of excellence within it, so we're very interested in how animals are kept alive in production and in high welfare states in production. The Centre of Excellence for Aquatic Animal Health And the second one is around seafood safety, International Centre of Excellence for Seafood Safety. And that looks at all of the potential hazards and risks that occur after production for the consumption of aquatic animals, mainly from aquaculture. Within the theme, we also have 3 designations, one to the OIE, which is the Collaborating Centre for Emerging Aquatic Animal Diseases. So we're very keen to look at pathogens and diseases which are emerging in aquaculture, how to describe them, how to get information out there quickly about what they are. The second centre is around AMR, which is antimicrobial resistance, I'm sure you all know, and that's a centre for the FAO. And the third one for bivalve sanitation around another centre for the FAO. We've also got a very close link with UK academia, and we have a joint centre at the University of Exeter, quite nearby to my laboratory in Weymouth, called Sustainable Aquaculture Futures, and that looks to tap in really to a lot broader array of expertise than we have within our own organisation to the academic space within the UK. And that's co-directed with myself by Professor Charles Tyler down there in Exeter. So that's how the theme is set up. We're really keen to work on how to keep animals alive and in high welfare status, and how to ensure that the seafood arising from aquaculture can be consumed safely by people. When you sort of do these presentations, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an insight into who I am and what I've done over the last number of years. I sort of summarised about 20 years of my sort of work and outputs in this slide with this word cloud, and I sort of realised that I do obviously work quite a lot on marine diseases, aquatic diseases, pathology, invertebrates, and so on. For about sort of 10 years, I ran the European Union Reference Laboratory for Crustacean Diseases, and that was really focusing on pathogens which may affect obviously crustaceans in production in the wild. So I've spent a lot of my time working on those species, but actually also found myself working quite a lot with wild and farm mollusks, important parts of the farming sector within Europe, and also wild and farmed fish. So my first 10 years or so at Cfas was spent looking at sort of ecotoxicological effects of chemical contaminants on fish, including flatfish like this one shown here, and looking at things like liver cancer and intersex. So a wide array of sort of experience, but focused pretty much on the health outcomes of exposure to pathogens and chemicals in some cases of aquatic animals. Specifically been involved with some individual descriptions, so quite a lot of the work of my team and the group and the theme generally associates itself with what is this new pathogen that's occurred, or this novel pathogen we described in this farming or wild situation. And I'll just give you this little example here of why that's quite important in my impression. This gives an example of we work on a group called Microsporidia. And you know, people could describe that as being a fairly niche or hobbyist group to work on, but this gives an example of where knowledge of those pathogens existing in wild systems can lead you to be able to describe more accurately ones which emerge in aquaculture. So some work on wild edible crabs in the UK allowed us to sort of get to the bottom of the taxonomy of a novel pathogen in tiger shrimp in Thailand in this case. And over that description, over those several years, that sort of niche description that occurred originally then ended up being a very, very important emerging disease that we now know as EHP. That is now very, very common in white shrimp right across Asia and other parts of the world, causing big production problems. And now you're even at the point where review papers are being written about that pathogen group. And also we are now knowing a lot more about the phylogeny of them and how they link to other well-known pathogens, for instance, even in humans. So this one, EHP, is very closely related to one called EPI, which causes infections within AIDS patients and other people with immunosuppression. So fairly niche beginnings, but also you get to the point where you're really able to put them into context with emergence and their importance. And in this case, shrimp diseases have some parallels with human pathogens which exploit immunosuppressed people. So yes, using phylogeny at the heart of that is very key to the laboratory I work in. Where we're going to within animal health work, really, it seems to be that we are able now to apply this much broader array of tools. So especially with the onset of next generation sequencing and those sort of high throughput approaches to understanding microbiomes, I think what's happening now is that we are placing those individual pathogens that we've traditionally worked on in context with a much broader microbiome, or pathobiome as a phrase is often used, that is associated with those diseases as they emerge. And some of this work with my colleague David Bast at Cfas, if you look at the chart on the left hand side, it sort of depicts the idea that the symbiome is the sort of the microbiome that is in us and in animals and plants at any given time, and it's the sort of the movement away from that healthy symbiome into so-called subclinical or clinical pathobiome that our bodies are continually fighting against and fighting with, to hopefully move along this sort of progression and recovery line to bring us back into that top corner. And animals are certainly no different to that. So what we're very interested in with Cfas and working with our collaborators is understanding how individual pathogens, I mentioned EHP on the previous slide, interact with that pathobiome to cause disease outcomes, and to not necessarily consider that single pathogens cause those diseases, but they are associated with that pathobiome that's with them. So I think a lot more of what we do over the next number of years will be profiling those sorts of consortia that live in those situations, and importantly, moving from a situation where we're just describing disease and what happened, in our case, in aquaculture farms and in the wild, but actually cataloguing much better conditions which are conducive to health rather than just disease. And I think that's where this field will move over the next number of years. So I'm here to talk about sustainable aquaculture and some bringing some of those ideas that I've got myself, and working with colleagues who work on different hazards to me, working on chemical hazards and biotoxins and so on, and how we build that collective knowledge into helping a sustainable industry to develop over the next 20 or 30 years. Blue food is sometimes the word that people use, but what they mean by that is seafood, I think. Seafood being animals that are farmed in water, so in fresh waters and in marine waters and brackish waters. So I might use blue food, I might use aquaculture, I might use seafood interchangeably, but we mean essentially animals and plants that are grown in water. In this case, shows a nice underwater shot of an oyster farm. Now, you may well know that aquaculture, this chart has shown many times, aquaculture is on the rise. I was born in 1975, and when I was born, my parents would have been consuming mainly fish and seafood that was captured from a fishery. So fishing boats gathering fish from the sea and from rivers, and that's what made up most of the seafood consumption back in the 70s. We're now at a place where around about 50% of all the seafood consumed globally comes from aquaculture, with the other 50% from fisheries. And by the time my children get to my age, in about 2050, the majority of the seafood that they will be consuming will not be coming from a fishery, which is actually flat or slightly declining globally, but from this expansive aquaculture sector. So there's a real change occurring with where we source seafood from, and from a hunter-gatherer system that we've all grown up with, to that sort of aquaculture system where rivers, lakes, ponds, streams and the open ocean will be used increasingly for growing seafood. And Cfas and many of my colleagues who work in this space are really interested in how to make that expanded sector as sustainable as possible. If you look into a bit more of a detail about what that direction of travel is, the modelling proposes that there will be about 100,000 tonnes more seafood from aquaculture emerging onto the seafood supply chain by about 2050. That's the top chart. The trajectories for different parts of that sector differ. So freshwater fish are currently and will maintain and enhance their position as the most important component of that supply, with modest but not insignificant rises in mollusks, crustaceans and marine fish shown in that top chart. And that bottom chart is the same thing, just showing the proportional importance of those sectors. So you can see freshwater fish there, the projected rise from where we are now over the next 10 and then beyond years, coming from OECD and FAO projections, are looking to make freshwater fish a much more important source of protein globally, with relative declines in some of the other proportional importance of the other sectors. But that's where we are at the moment with the modelling that's currently done. So there's big rises, but the rises are not always consistent between those different forms of seafood. Where you look at the locations in which that production is occurring, in Cfas where I work, a lot of the work we do overseas is working with ODA countries or overseas development assistance or low and middle income countries, where if you look at a map like this, which is from our own Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, the coloured countries in orange and purple and so on are those which are that are able to attract aid into those nations from the UK, and there'll be a similar map available for most countries who provide aid in this way. I've overlaid on top of this asterisks which show the top 16 aquaculture producing nations in the world, and the majority of them, if not all of them, happen to be nations which we would consider ODA. So there is an expansion occurring within these nations. There's traditionally large producers, and there is also the expansion to 2050 will also occur in those nations predominantly, albeit there will be expansion in other parts of the world as well. And what we're really interested in is if hazards such as disease are causing problems for aquaculture, which we know they are, how well will these countries be able to sort of cope with those challenges as those industries expand and as the world gets increasingly reliant on seafood supplies from those nations in the next couple of decades. But it's not only low and middle income countries in which there are challenges. This is an analysis done with colleagues in the US looking at the ICES nations. These are these nations which are coloured in orange on this map, and they're listed down the middle of the globe there. And some of those analyses looking forward to 2050 also show that in those nations there is going to be a gap in seafood supply over that period to the tune of around about 7 million metric tons. So those nations and the people in those nations consuming millions of tons more seafood than is going to be able to be serviced by the fishery. So they're inherent within that. If that supply chain is going to be serviced, then you would imagine there should be then an expansion of the sector in those nations to supply that seafood, especially as south-south trade or trade between developing nations is likely to increase in the future, making supply chains into, in this case, the ICES nations such as the US and the UK and the rest of Europe more difficult. So seafood is complex. So moving on from that, we know aquaculture is expanding. We know where it is and where it's going to expand, and we also want to be thinking about that. Well, if we project forward 20 or 30 years, what is the shape of that sector? How would we like to see it shaping up in relation to net zero aspirations, biodiversity protection aspirations, food security aspirations, and so on? And the One Health aquaculture approach is something that tries to encapsulate all of those different facets and bring it together into I would call it a sort of policy framework that nations who are looking to do this expansion can look at their own system and say, well, actually, how well are we doing against this, and how can we develop these metrics within our own system? Aquatic foods are gaining a lot of attention recently. This is Dr. Thilsted from World Fish, and she recently won the World Food Prize for her excellent work on showing how fish and nutrition that fish provides certainly in low and middle income countries, and especially for children, can be really, really beneficial. And I think it shows that aquaculture is certainly something that is now moving more and more onto the agenda of the sort of food security narrative of many nations, and her work has certainly helped to shine a light on that, so that's really good to see. And more and more papers are coming out in the literature which are starting to talk about the relative performance of aquaculture to other sort of more, if you like, familiar forms of food sectors, such as in this case chicken. So this is an excellent piece of work by Jessica Caffart and so on, colleagues from the US, who look at some of these emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen, phosphorus, freshwater use, and so on, per ton of edible weight of different aquaculture and marine fishery species compared to this sort of yardstick of chicken, which from what I can understand is considered to be the sort of, if you like, most efficient form of protein production considered globally. And I won't go into detail on this map, but really essentially what you're looking at is that certainly the non-fed and extractive species from aquaculture are particularly efficient at forming food from our environment compared to some other sectors. And the paper also talks about how gains can also be made within the sectors of aquaculture. And it's fair to say that for fed aquaculture, that's species which are fed with, for instance, other forms of food, and certainly fish meal and fish oils, then the emissions that are associated with those sectors are mainly from the feeds. So the more and more focus that can be made onto the feeds and making them more efficient will drive efficiencies into those aquaculture systems into the future. For interest, in fisheries, the main emissions are associated with fuel required to go out and get the fish and pull the fishing nets along. That's the main fisheries emissions there. So the paper talks about how some of those gains can be made. And what is good about this, it's starting to place aquaculture into the same sort of language and into the food sector, food systems language, and move it away from being a subject that people talk about only in specialist conferences about aquaculture to being more broadly talked about in food, in the context of food, which I think we all need to move towards as we consider this sector to be part of that food system in the future. With all this said, aquaculture has a lot to offer, I think, in terms of efficient food systems. But if you follow any of the literature or the mainstream media on this subject, then you'll realise that sustainability in this and other sectors is not a given. It won't just happen unless we design sustainability into the systems that we are looking to grow our food in. And there are many reports within the literature talking about farmed fish escapes, where there's integration genetically into the local stocks. Mangrove destruction is a well told story. The overuse of antibiotics and therapeutics in aquaculture then sort of causing contamination of products or leaking out into the system, into the wider natural system around those farms. The use of bonded labour or slave labour in some farming systems, and so on. So sustainability is not just going to happen to aquaculture. We need to really face up to some of these issues, think about them, think what we don't want to see in the system, and help nations to move towards designing sustainability into aquaculture. But considering sustainability to be very broad, so it doesn't just associate with the environment or keeping animals alive and in high welfare, but also the people working in it, how they're being employed, what's the gender roles within those systems, are we appreciating what they are, and so on. So a very diverse set of sustainability metrics are likely going to be needed for aquaculture and other food sectors as we move into the next 20 or 30 years of their development. And that's where the One Health aquaculture story comes in. We did a lot of work with colleagues within our Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and across different agencies and academic experts within the UK, and came up really with a set of metrics which are shown on this wheel here. And if you sort of look at how the wheel works, if you go from the inside, it's really asking the question, what research, evidence, policy and legislation would we like to see in place if indeed we are to be achieving sustainable aquaculture using a One Health approach? And colleagues like, people like myself, we might find ourselves saying, well, actually, we are pathologists, we work on animal health and diseases. My metric is probably something like organism success metric 1 on the top of the wheel in the yellow section there, where we're looking to keep farm stock healthy and when we don't want spillovers of a disease into the wild and so on. But I recognise from looking at this that sustainability is much, much wider than just the bit that I can offer to this research evidence policy space. It might require environmental scientists who are looking to find systems that best protect biodiversity and natural capital, or how to use water optimally, or how to make the farm in the lowest spatial footprint to not displace biodiversity. So there's specialists there who probably wouldn't consider themselves to be aquaculture specialists or experts, but are certainly required to bring their skills into this if we are to design a sustainable aquaculture system for the future. And similarly, at the bottom of that wheel, in the orange section, are those who understand sustainability from a people perspective. We may think, well, that's nutritious and safe foods getting to the right people. Yeah, that's one. But also, how do we generate income from the system that's equitable? How do we ensure that gender equality is built into these systems from the start? How do we ensure that they are creating good jobs for people that they are proud to have and proud to work in? So there's a set of metrics there again, which people like myself, who are coming from the animal health side, certainly wouldn't have expertise in, and probably wouldn't have thought about those being important issues to build into a sustainable sector, but they are going to be needed. So the One Health approach, when you look through this lens, offers a very useful mechanism to ensure that we are covering a wide array of bases and we can build policy and the research and evidence required to support that policy into sustainable systems within our own nations and more regionally and globally. And I think that approach to food systems, it allows One Health to be moving out of the domain of just the vet or the medic into now wider society, and we can use it to design, or try to design at least, sustainable, in this case, food systems or food sectors. So it works for when it's applied to a problem, and it brings in a wider array of people. And I think that's a message I really want to get through today, is that even if you don't consider yourself working in this sector, then your skills are almost certainly going to be useful to build that sustainable sector within your national space going forward. If you're interested in reading a bit more about this, there's a paper that I've listed at the bottom there, and there's a small collection of papers which are being put together in Nature Food now under the heading of One Health Aquaculture, that you can read a bit more about this approach and see how different facets are being sort of put together with it. I won't go through these in detail, but these are some sort of screenshots in the paper where those metrics are described in a bit more detail. So I've talked about the human health ones already, talked about gender equality in the system. Some of the interesting things there from an animal health perspective is that we know, for instance, that many of the farms may be run by women, but actually when we hold workshops about diagnostics and how to recognise disease, maybe men will appear at those meetings and the information flow does not go back to the farm. So those are some of the power systems we need to understand within these nations if we want change to occur in the way it needs to occur. So thinking about how to bring some of these human metrics into our work has been really an eye-opener for people like myself. Organism health, more familiar with this, and this is talking about how to keep animals alive in farms. And there's a list of metrics there which are very familiar things, including us not wanting to, if you like, affect surrounding biodiversity by the spillover of either pathogens or chemical hazards coming from those farms. So the AMR, antimicrobial resistance story, is very much about this set of metrics where, for instance, antibiotics used in farms could well have an effect not only on the consumer of those products, but also on animal health within the surrounding environment. So looking to reduce the impact and spillover of those effects is really important, and that's captured within the organism health part of the wheel. And finally, on the environmental health side, trying to consider how we make this footprint as minimal as possible. How do we enhance biodiversity around the farms that we are developing, and ensure that we are creating the lowest footprint spatially and energetically that we possibly can with these systems, and a lot of that will revolve around how to create better water quality so we can do farming, but also ensure that we don't affect the water quality around farms by releasing chemicals and other hazards into the environment around those farms. So environmental health is absolutely integral to the development of a One Health aquaculture system. And put together, what the paper proposes is that you can assess sectors within a nation. So it may well be that here we assess 3 independent sectors that operate within a nation, maybe seaweed, mollusk farming and salmon farming. And we then look to say, well, actually, how well are we doing against these success metrics in those specific sectors? And where we're doing well, we should maintain that approach and continually improve. And where we're not doing so well, metrics aren't being achieved, we can put research, evidence and policy into place to fatten out that wheel so we start to develop better performance in those metrics. And I think it gives nations at a policy level a sort of checkpoint against how well they're doing and where to develop and where to focus policy. So it's proposing a sort of makeover for policy in relation to aquaculture, but using a One Health approach to operationalise it in relation to this food sector and these food systems. But what we also acknowledge within all of this is that it's very difficult to do all of this at once. These metrics are not going to be developed overnight for a given sector. They might take several years or even decades to build in to a given sector. And this small outlook that was in Nature last year started to talk about how aquaculture can overcome some of those sustainability problems. And some of the input we provided to there was saying, well, if you do not control animal health hazards and food safety hazards that may occur within, in this case, aquaculture, you will use up a lot of human capital and a lot of environmental capital to potentially get nowhere in terms of food and wealth. So it's really important to, I think, prioritise the control of animal health and food safety as a critical early part of that One Health aquaculture strategy. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a few examples of that and how we're looking to do that. Failure to do so creates instability in the system, and the instability will then have implications for those farmers who are actually looking to develop incomes from these systems, but also the environment that surrounds the farms, where there may well be then impacts on biodiversity and climate resilience and so on when farms fail because of the hazard impact on those farms. So focusing on animal health and food safety is a critical early part of the One Health aquaculture approach. So we're going to spend the next few slides just focusing in a little bit on that, what we mean by that, focusing on the hazards. Hazards in this context for me mean chemical hazards that might be present in environments naturally or released by human activities. They include animal pathogen hazards such as viruses and bacteria, which can cause disease and kill animals in farms. And they also include pathogens that are present in environments that end up in seafood. So Vibrios being a natural pathogen that can end up in seafoods that we can then get sick from eating, but also pathogens that we put into water that will end up coming back to us. So sewage pollution, for instance, and putting in norovirus and salmonella into systems that then accumulate in seafood and come back to us would also be considered within that hazard spectrum. Importantly, when we're considering aquaculture and how those hazards interact, it's important that we don't consider aquaculture to be one single thing. It's certainly not. It's a very, very diverse sector. And what we talk about within the hazard space is the scenarios in which hazards can interact with. So the scenarios for this seaweed farmer in Asia are very different to the hazards that may impact that large offshore structure. You see that yellow structure there, where they're looking to farm finfish 200 miles from the shoreline. They're very different scenarios, and hazards will interact very differently with those systems. So we're trying to develop a system where we can understand what that interaction is and provide the best advice to those systems to minimize and mitigate and control the hazards that may cause efficiency problems for those individual systems. So we're talking about hazards, we're talking about the array of hazards. This comes from a paper we have just coming out in the next few weeks in Nature Food, which talks about applying an all hazards approach to seafood scenario sort of mapping. And again, I mentioned these chemicals and pathogens which are in there. They're in this sort of these three major categories. But what we also do then, when we're associating with a given scenario, is we come up with a so-called customized hazard list relating to those headings that make some sense for that sector. So for instance, for shrimp farming, we may well have specific viral pathogens that we're interested in, like white spot syndrome virus, whereas for tilapia farming, we're talking about more tilapia lake virus. So would be considered a viral pathogen, but they are nuanced for those specific sectors. And you can extrapolate that through the whole list for the other hazards as well. When we look to apply this, then I'll lead you from the top to the bottom so we understand what this diagram means. The first job is to really understand the scenario we're talking about. And by scenario, it might be, for instance, that country X wants to develop a new sector for oyster farming in Bay A, B, and C, and they want to harvest that product and process it live for export to another market, let's say the European Union, for end consumption raw. So that'd be a kind of scenario for that specific farming in a specific location of a certain species that's destined for a market and consumption in a certain way. So we're starting then to really mine down about where products will go, how they're made, and where they're produced. Once we know that, we can look at that hazard list, the chemicals, the animal pathogens, the human pathogens, and we can come up with our specialists and with any specialist who's in these areas, a customized hazard list for that particular scenario. We can then work out that if we did nothing to control those hazards, and we look at how they interact with early life, with grow out, with the harvest phase, with processing, with trade, and with consumption, how do those individual customized hazards interact with those different parts of the supply chain? We can work out then the overall impact of them in an uncontrolled way if we do nothing about it, using a simple 2x2 risk assessment of severity and likelihood of that happening at a given phase. And that's that sort of diagram with the red outline shown there, an uncontrolled impact of those hazards on that specific scenario that we've defined. Then what we do, if we look to apply a risk mitigation matrix, we ask the question, how do we control those given hazards at specific phases? So how do we control white spot syndrome virus causing a problem at early life stage production of shrimp? That would be a specific scenario. How do we stop norovirus accumulating within or being contaminating seafood that might end up on somebody's plate and be consumed? How do we do that? And if you look at that as a matrix, you can then work out where official interventions may occur at government level and where industry interventions may occur, so HACCP procedures and so on, and even where behavioural interactions may also control the hazard. So don't eat this raw, only eat it cooked would be a behavioural intervention that could be made to reduce the risk of a hazard causing a problem. So that whole process then goes round in a circle, and once we have the risk mitigation matrix in place, we can then say, well, what is the controlled risk then if we applied all those measures to controlling those complex hazards? And then there you get a shrunken down version of the image there shown in that green spider diagram. Once you have an acceptable level of risk, you can then decide to either progress with that scenario and the control measures and put that into place in your system, or you can go back round the loop and say, we're never going to be able to farm that species in that location for that reason, but we could do it if we move location, if we change the species, if we changed the type of consumption that might be happening. So we can't sell them raw there, we can sell them cooked. So there are ways of then going back and advising the scenario to refine that for specific locations where you're looking to farm these things. So I think this is the first time where all of the hazards have been looked at in a round, rather than just people like myself looking at viruses and my colleagues looking at biotoxins and so on. So we're trying to get this all hazards approach. That's just an example of the hazard matrix. The hazards are down the left-hand side. The life stages of the supply chain is along the top, from early life to consumption. And the red, orange and grey bars there just show you the different scenarios. One is uncontrolled, we do nothing. Yellow is controlled, where we think interventions could occur at specific phases but don't accumulate through the chain. And the grey control 2 there shows where interventions at one phase catalyse benefits at subsequent phases. And that's shown in this chart. The detail's not important, but what it shows you the ability to do is shrink down that risk or de-risk the food scenario that you are looking to try to develop. And what we're really interested in working with people on is what the benefits are of doing that. This costs money to do this. It would cost money to intervene at the government and industry level to put these measures in place. But what we're really interested in doing is then working out what the benefits of this are. Some of the approaches are already available for benefiting or showing the benefits for yield or for profit. That they're relatively easy ones to say, well, how much yield was saved by doing these interventions. But what we're really interested in is pushing that further and saying, what about if you had to measure this in terms of biodiversity protection or climate mitigation from doing this hazard control? How would that look? So we're really interested in pushing these metrics further out to work out how hazard control is at the heart of a sustainable food system, but it's also at the heart of protecting the environment and biodiversity in that environment. The current work we're doing in this space is really all around this, and we're doing a lot of work in low and middle income countries to try to help where we can with this kind of work. And we have something called the Ocean Country Partnership Programme in the UK Blue Planet Fund, a big fund that's looking to fund work in the marine environment. And we've got a programme on One Health Aquaculture, which is broadly based around this model of asking the nation what they're looking to try to achieve in terms of food production volume, and where and when and for who. And that's part of this sort of questionnaire approach. The risk pool I've just described to you then applies to a given scenario using data that's available, or maybe a collection of new data on those hazards. And then the provision of a biosecurity and seafood safety plan that says this is what you would have to probably do if you were to try to get your scenario working in the way you're looking to do that. Many of these systems are data limited, so gaining that data and putting it into a place where people can use it in some sort of open GIS portal is at the centre of this as well. So hopefully over time, our knowledge about hazards in aquatic systems that lead to problems for food production and aquaculture will grow, and we can start to then use that to create safer food systems. Some of that work's been done in Bangladesh, where we're looking at mollusk production, for instance, in some open systems, and also in enclosed pond systems for tilapia and other fish species in these locations. So embedding this sort of One Health approach in those locations, working with colleagues in World Fish and other great people in country. In India, my colleague have pictured David Bassett just to show you what he looks like. Some of you may know him. He's been sort of pioneering this approach of looking at pathobiomes and much more complex etiologies of disease in certain locations. And in aquaculture, what we're starting to see is that there's a rise of the syndrome. So syndromic conditions or cryptic diseases that we can't quite put down to individual pathogens are becoming apparently more common. And the application of these more sort of profiling tools, such as sequencing, to profile the microbes and eukaryotes that are there, and even viruses that are there, is helping to provide a new picture on the kind of consortia of diseases that are causing problems. And some of this work is going to have to feed its way through into how we legislate and how we design biosecurity systems for these farms. Maybe even moving away from single pathogen biosecurity focus to how do we control for pathobiomes, or how do we encourage microbiomes which are healthy within those ponds. So again, that movement towards health rather than just towards disease. And David's leading on some of that work. In Thailand, I showed this picture at the start, some really nice work by my colleague Diana Menardi. And what she's been doing there is looking at the conditions that are associated with these so-called emergency harvest scenarios in shrimp farming in this case. And it's really too late to come in and tell farmers after the event this is what happened in this pond, because they've already experienced the outbreak and the losses and so on, and the inefficiencies are already inbuilt into that. What we're really interested in doing is moving into that pre-emergent phase to say, well, what were the conditions that changed in that pond in the preceding weeks and days before the outbreak occurs. And some of her work is looking at, for instance, yellowhead outbreaks in these ponds, and showing what sort of microbiological changes were happening in the pond system in the weeks that led up to that yellowhead outbreak, in this case at week 6 within the pond. So really, again, moving conceptually from emergent diseases to the pre-emergent phase, and using this toolbox to try to understand that. I think that's a really good example of where the field of One Health will be moving in the future in relation to aquaculture. One final example in Tanzania. This is a nice piece of work that's been done with colleagues in Scotland under something called the Global Seaweed Programme, and it's a really good example of where One Health thinking can be brought into aquaculture. In Tanzania, this lady is farming capophycid seaweeds, and it's mainly women farmers in these locations in Asia and Africa. And what we see is they generally farm in very shallow waters where stresses with temperature and salinity and so on can be quite high, and disease occurs within these locations and can take away the crop and profit for these people. And you might have someone like myself go in here and say, right, I'm going to investigate the molecular basis for this, and I'm going to find diseases and pathogens and describe them and write papers about that. But actually, working with colleagues, social scientists and other colleagues in country, it's really shown that more simplistic and high impact sort of change can be made by simply moving the farms out of shallow water. So in slightly deeper water where there's less stresses and there's less than implications for health, But the barriers to doing that are many of these women cannot swim or don't want to enter deeper water or don't have access to boats. In those situations, providing that infrastructure or confidence to do that can actually remove disease much better than a technological intervention with a diagnostic or some pathology work. So a good example where One Health thinking and bringing that wheel in has really provided some big changes to these farming systems that were nothing to do with technology, but to do with listening and to working on how to make those farms more efficient from a human perspective. Good example of One Health thinking. Finally, I'll leave you with this with a slide, next couple of slides, aquaculture in the wider food system. Many of you will be working on other food sectors and food systems, and I'm really interested in how aquaculture and aquatic foods generally are going to be seen within those systems over coming years, because they have a lot of potential, but the ability to farm in water will become increasingly dependent on what we do on land. Animals in water require clean water, they require low contamination, etc., from industrial contaminants and pollutants and so on. So the interaction with land and water food sectors and the food system as a whole needs to be considered in the round much more consistently than it is at the moment. And we're working on making some initial assessments of some of that work. Where does aquaculture occur? And what are the potentials for it to be an important food system for those given nations? And just going to leave this one slide with you to sort of let you know some of the thinking around this. This is a piece of work that considers how much seafood is being consumed by nations of the world per capita, and placing that in context with how much aquaculture happens in that same country per capita. It doesn't make the assumption that aquaculture from that country will feed those people, because there's a complex seafood market, but it goes to show the sort of level of engagement with aquaculture in a given nation related to the habits, the food habits of that nation. So nations which are considered to be type 1 countries at the top of the table here in blue are those nations which produce a lot of food from aquaculture, more than their people actually consume. So over 100% of their consumption comes potentially from their aquaculture sector. And at the bottom of the chart shows nations which do and don't eat seafood in different proportions, but very little of their food, their aquatic food, comes from aquaculture. So they're very low adopting countries. And if you map that onto the globe, as I've done there, and you look at the countries in red, you can see those nations which produce a very, very small amount of their seafood requirements from aquaculture, and where aquaculture could make a big difference to food security. And obviously there, Africa stands out as a nation where, or as a continent where many nations in that continent are producing low amounts of aquaculture, and there could be some big interventions made there to increase aquaculture therein. We're not the only ones saying it, but this gives a good new look at how nations' adoption is placed in context with their consumption. And yeah, so we're interested in looking at with those nations, working with those nations about how they may develop their sectors for food security for their own people. And just to give you an indication of what we're doing with that, under this sort of Blue Planet Fund program, we do that via having sort of listening workshops with nations and working our way into this kind of process I talked about before, about asking what they're looking to achieve, where they want to achieve it, what sorts of seafood they want to make, and then placing that in the context with the risks that could be there, and helping them to sort of work their way around those risks to create that sort of food sector that will provide the food in the future. So in summary, my final slide, I hope what I've convinced you is high animal health and food safety status is at the heart of this sector sustainability. If we can't create animals that stay alive within these systems, and we can't eat them, then it's not really seafood. It's only seafood if you can eat it, is a phrase we often use. A One Health approach can be designed into aquaculture and other food sectors with sustainable food as an outcome. But what we're going to need there is a much wider dialogue for those who don't work in or on aquaculture to come into that discussion. So it shouldn't be a discussion just for aquaculture conferences where aquaculture people go to, but aquaculture being talked about as a food sector that feeds the world, and how do we make it sustainable in relation to other food sectors. To do that, you need much wider science and policy expertise across this organism, environment and human health space. So rather than just specialists who work in aquaculture doing that, you need this wider discussion, which I hope the One Health aquaculture approach has opened that up to say that One Health is something that everybody works in and should bring their expertise to try to solve some of these big problems that we have. I believe there's an enhanced role for national government in this. When you're looking to design a food system or food sector in any way, leaving it only to industry to handle those metrics for organism, environmental and human health outcomes is not going to work. Industries will have accreditation schemes and approval schemes that customers will use in their own way, and all sectors have that, including aquaculture. But there's another level here, I think, that government needs to step in and also help those sectors ensure that they are creating, for instance, good environmental health in the system, but also to provide benefits to those aquaculture sectors of controlling water quality and environmental quality around those farms to allow them to succeed. That's a role that government does well, looking after environment and measuring contamination and controlling contamination and so on. That's a sort of a public good that has to be provided by government. So a greater role for government in One Health aquaculture is required. And at the very, very heart of this for aquaculture, there's been much debate around the impact of aquaculture on systems, on natural systems, but we need a much stronger discussion around how aquaculture to succeed to provide 70% of our food by 2050 will need an environment that allows that to happen. And most of the issues that aquaculture will face in terms of hazards come from the land and from us on land. So we need to be much more careful about what we're putting into our rivers and into our lakes and streams that end up in the oceans, because that's the environment that we are going to be increasingly reliant on for our food in the future. Final slide, just to remind you again, that's our theme, healthy seafood. Be delighted to talk to any of you about how to collaborate with us in the future. Please get in touch. My email's at the top, and if you like to follow any of this stuff on Twitter, then on that hashtag or my Twitter account, then you'd be more than welcome to join. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks to everybody who was present for this talk. We do have an opportunity for questions, although, again, we were not live streaming, and so any questions we get, we will need to forward to Dr. Stentiford. And actually, I'm going to ask Dwayne, is there a way for people to enter questions on this particular platform?
Sure, they can use the question box, the chat box, the meeting conversation, which you can see up at the top. Also right next to that, where are the meeting reactions. The first reaction is a hand. So if you'd like to verbally ask your question, you can raise your hand and then we will let you unmute and you can ask your question.
Okay, I think again, in this instance, probably use the chat box so that, again, since we don't have Dr. Stentiford in person, but again, we'll try to make certain any questions that you have will be answered. And again, thanks for everybody to their attendance. And again, stay put. We have the second component of our speaker session this afternoon. Dr. Marcos Salemi will be speaking, and we're a few minutes early, but probably let's go ahead and get started on with Marco. Marco is, if you will, one of our own here at UF. Although he was born in Sicily, he received his Ph.D. from Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and after a postdoc at UC Davis, joined the faculty here at UF in the Department of Pathology, Immunology, and Laboratory Medicine in the College of Medicine. He is currently a full professor in the department and holds the Holloway Endowed Chair in Chronic and Infectious Diseases. He has over 170 publications. And again, Marco, I didn't have your latest CV, and I imagine it's gone up beyond that, including multiple publications in high-profile journals such as Nature, Science, and PNAS, with a long history of grant support from NIH, NSF, and private foundations. His research initially focused on the phylogenomics of HIV, but has expanded through the years to include a number of different pathogenic organisms, including bacterial species and other viruses. And most recently, he's been involved in a series of studies of SARS-CoV-2. His talk today is entitled Phylogenetic Tracking of SARS-CoV-2 Variants in Emerging Coronavirus Zoonoses. And so with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Marco.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. Let me share my screen. I should be able to hear. Okay. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
All right. So, yeah, I will be talking about the tracking of SARS-CoV-2 variants and emerging coronavirus zoonosis in Florida and the Caribbean areas. Unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic has been raging for the past 2.5 years around the world. United States and Florida have been severely affected. And what I will be talking about in the next, hour or so is the experience and the work that we have been doing here in Florida through the Coronavirus Genomic Epidemiology Network, or CGNet, that is essentially a consortium, a network of collaborations that includes University of Florida, University of Central Florida, University of Miami, as well as the Department of Health, who have joined forces over the past 1.5 years, specifically to track new lineages, variant of concern, and understand the spread of these new lineages and their impact in vaccinated and unvaccinated populations, and of course also devise measures of public health interventions to try to curb epidemic spread. In doing so, we have been able, over the past 1.5 years, to develop really fast and effective pipelines for genomic sequencing of the viral genome. And you will see some of our results. We are currently capable of producing hundreds of sequences, of full genome sequences of coronavirus strains from infected patients. And most importantly, we are able in nearly real time to track the emergence of new mutations, new variants, and track their spread in the population, assess their impact in the vaccinated and unvaccinated populations. And towards the end of the talk, I will also show some of the most interesting results that we're having right now in applying and developing new artificial intelligence-based algorithm for the prediction of the emergence of new variant of concerns that we hope are going to be helpful, not just for the current pandemic, but potentially also for future pandemic in the fight for novel emerging infectious diseases. So the Florida Coronavirus Genomic Network, which, as I said, has been tracking for the past 1.5 years genomic variants of SARS-CoV-2 in Florida and the Caribbean area, essentially started its operations towards the end of 2020, thanks to generous intramural funds provided by the Vice President's Office of Research at UF, which gave us some initial funds to start a large sequencing project that allowed us to collect sequences that were samples that were at that time stored from several institutions around Florida, samples from patients that were found to be positive for coronavirus, and that we started sequencing to investigate which specific lineages of COVID-2 were actually circulating in Florida. And the objective of the coronavirus genomic networks were to assess the relative impact of SARS-CoV-2 variants in Alachua County, which is the county where Gainesville and the University of Florida are, but also statewide. So in general, and Florida, in Florida state, monitor coronavirus emergence and spread in the Caribbean region. The Emerging Pathogen Institute as a long-standing collaboration and several research projects that have been running in Haiti. And we used our contact in Haiti to getting samples from the island, which is an important hub for many emergency infectious diseases. Dr. Morris' group has done a lot of work, an impressive amount of work over the past several years, showing and demonstrating the emergence and the spread of several emerging pathogens in Haiti that eventually were very important, from Zika to Mayaro virus. Of course, others. Haiti has been hit since 2010 by a devastating cholera epidemic, so not just viral but also bacterial. So Haiti, in a way, is an ideal monitoring locale for observing the emergence of novel pathogens, and in our case, to monitor more closely the emergence of new coronavirus lineages. And we were also interested in specifically following the emergence of new mutations of interest of concern within specific populations, and in particular focus on both the vaccinated and unvaccinated populations. Very early on, we realized that even vaccinated people could be infected today. This is kind of common knowledge. We have more and more reports of vaccinated people that are infected with the Omicron variants, the so-called vaccine breakthrough cases. But as I will show soon enough, we realized already more than 1 year ago that vaccine breakthrough cases in fact did occur, and that several variants of concern had in fact the ability to infect fully vaccinated people, although usually vaccinated people tend to have much milder symptoms. And we could also show that vaccinated people can in fact transmit the infection despite the fact that most of the time they are asymptomatic. So assessing the impact of vaccination on virus dissemination was another of the major goal of the CGNet. And while we started our monitoring project through University of Florida funds, we also were able to secure extramural funding thanks to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and National SAIDS Foundation, that in the past year and a half have been funding our efforts to continue monitoring the evolution of the epidemic in the Florida area. So as I said at the very beginning, the idea was to develop a real-time genomic monitoring of the coronavirus epidemic. And what this means essentially is that we wanted to be able to obtain a large number of full genome viral sequences from a large number of patients, which was required given, unfortunately, the large number of newly infected patients that we would have on a weekly basis just in our area and all over Florida over the past year and a half alone, and be able essentially to obtain very rapidly the full genome and to analyze the information contained in this full genome in order to understand which specific lineages were circulating in Florida, whether or not new mutations were arising, and also to track this mutation and the spread and dissemination of these new lineages in specific population of interest. As I said, our investigation were mainly focused around the Alachua County area, so in northern Florida, but we also received samples from and collaborated, and we are still collaborating actively with University of Central Florida, especially in the Orlando area, with Baycare, which is a large private healthcare provider in the Fort Myers and Tampa Bay area. We also have a contract with the University of Miami that has been providing us samples from Miami-Dade County. And as I said at the beginning, we also collect and sequence coronavirus samples from Haiti through an ongoing collaboration with GACECO, a nonprofit organization that has been working in Haiti for many years. So our pipeline essentially allows us to collect between and process between 400 and 800 samples per week. We use the Illumina platform for next generation sequencing, which allows to specifically next generation sequences based on NovaSeq, which allows us to, in fact, sequence within 36 hours run up to 800 sequences in one single run. And essentially, as soon as we receive the samples, which are collected, which are received in our lab, as I said, on weekly basis, RNA is extracted and cDNA synthesized by using a robot. So the entire procedure is automatic, and for this large amount of samples, thanks to the robot, this usually takes about 24 hours. Then the next step is, of course, the library preparation, which can take about 1 to 2 days, depending on how many samples we have. And then, of course, there is the actual run on the NovaSeq platform. And as soon as the run is over, we use our bioinformatic pipeline, which we call PhyloFlaco. Is a pipeline that we have developed in-house thanks to our bioinformaticians, which takes the raw data from the next generation sequencing platform and obtains full genome sequences and eventually builds phylogenetic trees and analyze these sequences. This is a schematic representation of the pipeline. I won't describe really all the different steps. I just want to highlight that essentially we compare all our sequences with all the sequences already present in GSAID. GSAID is this huge database that has been developed since the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic. I have to say that there has been a tremendous effort around the world to sequence SARS-CoV-2, and this has been the largest sequencing effort of an emerging virus that has ever been overtaken by the scientific community. Just to give you an idea, in the first 10 years, and we are talking about the 1980s and 1990s, in the first 10 to 15 years of the HIV epidemic, about 60,000 sequences of HIV were sequenced around the world. And that's because, of course, in the 80s and 90s, obtaining a full genome sequence of a virus of HIV, which is about 1/3 in length compared to coronavirus, was a very complex and very costly, required costly operation. Thanks to next generation sequencing technique that are much faster, much cheaper, and our possibility to multiplex those operations, and so having high throughput machines that allows us to really literally process hundreds of samples in a very short period of time. Today, the scientific community, the past year and a half, the past 2 years, has been able to sequence more than 1.5 million. This is, I think, this is the latest count. GSAID right now contain more than 1.5 million, and the number is exponentially increasing literally every week of coronavirus sequences, full genome sequences. And our operation alone in the past year, as I will show you one of the next slides, has produced about 10,000 sequences here in Florida. So it's a massive amount of information, and as we will see later, is a massive amount of information that makes artificial intelligence methods particularly suited to analyze and to be used for discovery. Also, it's a massive amount of information that requires a massive amount of computer power to actually go through that, and that's why we had to develop specific bioinformatic pipelines to go through all this information. University of Florida is also one of the universities that has an incredible infrastructure in terms of computational powers. We host one of the fastest clusters in public universities in United States, and our recent collaboration with NVIDIA has allowed to expand greatly the computational capacity and the hardware infrastructure at the University of Florida. So our pipeline is right now implemented in the Hypergator, which is the University of Florida supercluster. And this has allowed us to essentially run our pipeline in a very short time. Usually the part of the pipeline that allows us to go from the raw data produced by the machine, the next generation sequencing, and we're talking about raw data from about on average 500 sequences per every run, to the obtaining of full genome sequences takes less than 24 hours, which is a pretty good turnaround time. And then all the other steps in the pipeline, which essentially require the filtering for high quality sequencing, the applying of classification methods to call the variant to decide which specific lineage each sequence belongs to, the build of phylogenetic trees, and eventually the analysis of these sequences in terms of epidemiological spread and putting them in the context of what we know clinically and demographically about the patients and the territory. All these different operations take really just a few minutes. So it's a very powerful system that essentially from beginning, the moment we acquire the samples, to the end, the moment where we in fact have a full report that allows us to figure out how many lineages are circulating, what is the proportion of the different lineages, and what are the risk factors associated with each lineage in terms of clinical factor, demography, whether or not the patients are vaccinated, and so forth. The entire essentially pipeline from samples acquisitions to a final report that eventually can be shared and is shared with public health stakeholder and weekly published on the UF EPI COVID-19 dashboard. This entire process take essentially on average 3 to 5 days. So we can literally monitor the epidemic as it is ongoing in near real time. And this is what we have been doing for the past year and a half. And our objective has been essentially, as I said at the very beginning, try to figure out what are the circulating and novel genomic variants of coronavirus that has been spreading in Florida, try to understand the origin and the timing of each variant, calculate using Phylodynamic techniques some epidemiological relevant parameters, like, for example, the expansion rate of specific lineages, and ultimately use all this information as input data for our artificial intelligence-based algorithms that will allow, as I show towards the end of this talk, to make a prediction for future epidemic spread. So, as I said, one of the first outcome of our effort in developing our monitoring and surveillance system of coronavirus lineages has been the development of novel bioinformatic tools. One of the first tools that we developed last year was a tool that we call TARDIS, Temporal and Diversity Distribution Sampler. And again, I won't go too much into the details of this, but I want just to mention it because this is quite crucial. As I said just a few minutes ago, one of the challenges in analyzing the impressive amount of sequence data that have been produced and continuously are being produced around the world since the beginning of the epidemic is that we are dealing with literally millions of viral strains that have been sampled in different locations around the world at different time points. But obviously, the sampling that we have of coronavirus strains around the world is far from being uniform. The effort of sequencing coronavirus around the world has not been guided by a sampling strategy that has been developed in a way that has been that would capture randomly all the major populations around the world, like we do when we essentially design a randomized control study. A very large number of labs around the world have been sequencing coronavirus strains in different locations at different time points, essentially based on convenience. So what we have here are literally hundreds of thousands, millions of data points, but each one of those data points are essentially the result of convenience sampling. So the result of this is that when we look at the database, at the ever increasing database of viral sequences, that the distribution of sequences per country and across time is very unequal. There are some countries that are overrepresented, countries like UK, France, United States at this point, that have really put a lot of effort in sequencing viral strains. Other countries that unfortunately haven't produced so many sequences. Countries like United States, for example, at the very beginning of the epidemic, were a little bit behind in terms of sequencing effort. Now we are doing much better. So also in terms of temporal distribution of the sequences, we have much less information in certain geographic areas about the early strains that were circulating and much more information about the later strains. So this unequal distribution of information in terms of genomic sequences, both in terms of their temporal distribution and in terms of which geographic areas have been heavily sampled for sequencing, poses a problem for any kind of downstream analysis, both in terms of epidemiology and molecular epidemiology. So we developed a tool that allows to continuously screen the database and essentially optimize, if for any kind of epidemiological study, optimize the sampling, essentially, that allows us to subsample, depending on the kind of study that we want to do and the kind of question that we're asking, that optimize to subsample data sets from specific geographic areas or within a specific time frame, in order to make sure that the sequences that are retrieved from the database are representative as much as possible of the lineages that were circulating in a particular geographic area within a particular time frame. That's necessary because, as I said, right now the database contains more than 1.5 million sequences. For any kind of analysis, it would be virtually impossible to analyze all of them. So imagine that you have some new viral strains that you want to analyze and you want to compare to the ones that are present already in the database. You need some way to extract from the database representative strains to compare to your novel strains. So the TARDIS tools allows you to do exactly that, to extract from the database in a dynamic way a subset of sequences that are representative depending on the problem that you want to address. So in terms of our actual sequencing work and the kind of monitoring that we've been doing in Florida, this gives you kind of an overview of the results that we have been obtaining. We started our sequencing effort in October 2020. We started with just, as you can see, just sequencing a few strains the last 3 months of 2020. Our sequencing effort increased over the years. Most of our samples came from Shands Hospital, and they covered basically Alachua County, and you have Path Labs, which have been serving the Alachua community and testing people in the entire county. But we also got samples, as I said, from Miami-Dade and a few samples especially middle of last year from the Tampa Bay area. Overall, we obtained so far about 15,000 samples. And as you can see, the total number, the samples for which we obtain high coverage. High coverage basically means that we were able to sequence at least 90% of the genome with at least 30x coverage at each site. So sequences that can be used for full genome analysis. And we have in general, we had a success rate between 74 and 89%, which is actually pretty good. And if you compare these results with other high throughput sequencing effort around the country, usually the success rate with next generation sequencing is around 65 to 75%. So we are within exactly the success rate, if not a little bit higher, to other high throughput monitoring efforts that are currently underway in other labs around the United States. So overall, until now, we have sequenced about 10,000 genomes that have been sampled over the past year and a half. So what have we found so far? So on the left here is a snapshot from the Johns Hopkins website that has been recording since the beginning of the epidemic the number of weekly cases as well as the number of deaths associated with SARS-CoV-2, specifically in Florida. Florida, as basically the rest of the world, has been experiencing several waves of coronavirus. Now, we have been talking of the coronavirus pandemic. It's been a pandemic. It is a pandemic that has spread all over the world. And it is obviously a pandemic that has been ongoing since essentially December 2019. But the number of infection has not been steady since 2019. The pandemic had different phases, as we all know. There has been spikes and there has been lull periods where there have been periods where the number of infections seemed to go down, and then eventually the number of infections went up again. Specifically in Florida, we had initial infections. The infections started kind of going up around May, June of 2019. We had a first spike here in July of 2020. And then by the end of 2020, it seemed almost the epidemic was actually going to almost disappear. There was another big spike in 2021, followed by a third spike, although with a lesser number of infected people last year during springtime, and the current spike, which had a much larger number of infections weekly, that are the one that we are currently going. And right now, the numbers are again going downwards. And unfortunately, the number of deaths have been also following the same trend with the waves of infections. And as we will see also in one of the next slides, but you can already see here by comparison with this slide, with the picture on the right that represents the number of lineages that have been circulating in Florida. And we have data, unfortunately, only starting from last year, because this is when we really started our monitoring. These major spikes essentially have coincided with the emergence of the variants of concern. This was essentially the spike that was related to the emergence of the Alpha variant. The Alpha variant, as you say here, it emerged both in Alachua County, and as you can see here, this is Florida as a whole, and this is Alachua County. And you can see here that essentially Alachua County, what happened in Alachua County in terms of variance frequency over time has mirrored quite closely what has been happening in the rest of Florida. So at the very beginning of the epidemic, there were a mixture of several different variants that were co-circulating. These areas are all grayed out for two reasons. First, because we had very few data, but in general, because this was a mixture of a lot of different lineages, neither of no particular lineage kind of seemed to overtook the population compared to anything else. However, the situation started changing between March and April of last year, when the Alpha variant appeared in Florida, and shortly after in Alachua County. The Alpha variant, which was the very first variant of concern that was described by the CDC, a variant that appeared to be more transmissible than the other variants, potentially more pathogenic. The Alpha variant very quickly became the major variant circulating in Florida and in Alachua County. They never really overtook the population. There were other variants like the Eta variant, for example, the Kappa variant, that were co-circulating, as well as other variants, but definitely more than 60% of the population at some point were infected with the Alpha variant. And that corresponded with the major spike here. And then around June and July of last year, a new variant emerged in Florida and soon after in Alachua County, and it was the Delta variant. Delta variant that was associated with an increased pathogenicity, increased transmissibility, more transmissible again of the Alpha variant, and again very rapidly replaced all the other existing variants. This time, the Delta variant being definitely more transmissible than all the previous variants. This time, it entirely replaced all the other circulating variants. In Alachua County specifically, basically just within 1 month and a half between the beginning of July and between the end of June and the middle of July, virtually all the new infections that were detected went from being a mixture of different variants of being entirely, virtually all of them, Delta infection. The same thing happened in the rest of Florida. That was the Delta wave. More recently, we are dealing with the Omicron wave. I will show about Omicron later on. So this is where we were at essentially between the middle and the end of last year, with Delta overtaking not just Florida, the rest of the United States and the rest of the world. That Delta was the big news. It was spreading very quickly among the unvaccinated people. And there were initially reports that Delta might also be spreading among vaccinated people, although back then was not really clear whether or not Delta could infect vaccinated people. It was not very clear whether or not vaccine breakthrough cases, so people infected with the Delta variant or with other variant, could transmit the infection. And that's where we became very interested in looking at vaccine breakthrough cases. And back then, we are talking about June, July of last year. At that point, we have sequenced about 4,400 full genomes. And of these 4,400 full genomes, we had already detected a little bit more than 100 breakthrough cases. So we started detecting breakthrough cases pretty early on in the epidemic. If you see the slide here on the right, this shows the middle panel here, show the breakthrough cases that we started detecting. You see here, we detected a first breakthrough case in February. This was someone infected with the Alpha variant. We detected another breakthrough case later on in the middle of March, still Alpha variant. We detect a couple of extra breakthrough cases infected by other lineages between February and March, several other breakthrough cases between May and June, other variants that were not Alpha. So essentially, already at the beginning of last year, a few breakthrough cases were detected, some of which were infected with the Alpha variant, which was a variant of concern, and most of them were infected by other variants that were not considered particularly aggressive by at least CDC standards. There was kind of an interesting observation, but we're mostly an anecdotal observation. Now, you have to consider the vaccine became available essentially at the end of 2020. We started vaccinating people in Florida at the beginning of January, essentially. So by essentially May 2020, Florida had already vaccinated at least 50% of the population. At least 50% of the population had received at least one shot. These breakthrough cases were specifically found in people that were fully vaccinated, people that have received already at least both doses of the vaccine. So we were interested in studying these cases because these were people that technically had been fully vaccinated, that they had received already the second dose for more than 2 weeks, so that supposedly were fully protected. And neither of these early vaccine breakthrough cases exhibited any symptom. They were completely or nearly almost completely asymptomatic. Obviously, our initial finding found out that they could be infected not just by the variant of concern alpha, but also by other lineages. But the number were so low that essentially we consider this as essentially a statistical oddity. As effective as a vaccine can be, it is always expected that some infection might occur in vaccinated people. It didn't seem particularly worrisome. However, situation changed dramatically when the Delta variant emerged and within the month of June and July took over the population of Florida and Alachua County. During that month, when the Delta variant essentially became the dominant, not just the dominant, the only variant that was spreading in Florida, suddenly we had a spike in breakthrough cases. Within a month, we basically we found almost another 100 breakthrough cases, essentially almost all of which were breakthrough cases infected with the Delta variant. Good news was that in all these cases, once again, 80% of them were asymptomatic. 20% of these cases only showed minor or mild illness. So again, at least in this very small number of cases that we could detect, the vaccine seemed to have 100% protection against severe disease. However, we started looking at transmission patterns through contact tracing and through phylogenetic analysis, because obviously we had the full genome sequences, so we could look at phylogenetic trees and phylogenetic relationships between the strains in the cases that were infected and with the vaccine breakthroughs and other viruses circulating in the populations. And both through phylogenetic analysis and contact traces, we could confirm several instances in which, in fact, a vaccine breakthrough case transmitted the infection directly to another individual. So vaccinated people, this was back in July of last year, could be infected by the Delta variant and could transmit the infection. It was really the first evidence back then, concrete evidence that in fact infection could occur from vaccinated individuals infected with coronavirus. Now, we decided also to look at the viral load with these individuals because infection occurs if the carrier has a sufficient number of viral copies in that allows transmission in the upper respiratory system. Studies last year and the year before, both experimental studies and theoretical modeling, have shown that in order for an infected host to be viable, to have a probability to produce a secondary infection, that host has to carry at least about 1,000 copies of the virus in the upper respiratory system. The 1,000 copies per milliliter is what is called in the literature the transmissibility threshold. Less than 1,000 copies essentially is a viral load that is makes very unlikely, almost negligible, the probability that that particular host will transmit the infection. Above 1,000 copies, the probability of causing a secondary infection becomes higher, especially if that person is in close contact with another person and neither of the two is wearing a mask, and this contact is prolonged more than 10 to 15 minutes in a closed area. We developed our own in-house quantitative viral load assay we didn't trust too much CD values, because CD values, of course, give you an idea of the viral load, but they are not, they don't really measure accurately the viral load. Viral load here in this table here is measured as in logs. So essentially, since our threshold is 1,000 here, whatever value is above 4 is above the transmissibility threshold. And as you can see here, the viral load for each one of these donors, D1, D2, and D4, that were donors for which, of vaccine breakthrough cases for which we had proof through contact tracing and phylogenetic tracking that they transmitted infection, the viral load was definitely higher than the transmissibility threshold. Not surprising, obviously. In all these cases, we collected the sample within 4 to 8 days from initial infection. So this means that essentially these people that were infected basically around, on average, 1 week post-infection had sufficient viral load in their upper respiratory system to transmit the infection to someone else, and in fact, they did so. At this point, we wanted to know, in fact, how common was this, or how probable was that a vaccine breakthrough case could have a viral load sufficient for transmitting the infection. And so we decided to measure the viral load in all our breakthrough cases. And essentially, this is what we found was interesting, and at the same point, a little bit worrisome. So if you see here the table at the end, the y-axis represents the viral load that we measure in each one of the breakthrough cases, and they are arranged in the x-axis in terms of days from full vaccination. So the idea was that if the vaccine, those people were all vaccinated either with Pfizer or with Moderna, so the mRNA vaccines, and our hope was that the vaccine somehow gave some measure of sterilizing immunity. So we were expecting that people that had been vaccinated for no more than 4 to 5 months, so people that had been vaccinated more recently, probably would have a lower viral load, because the vaccine would still confer a pretty high sterilizing immunity, whereas people that have been vaccinated for a longer period of time, there have been many reports in the literature that antibody titer would go down after 6 months. So we expected that after 6 months also sterilizing immunity would go down, and therefore people that have been vaccinated for more than 6 months would have a viral load in generally higher than the vaccination, the transmissibility threshold. But this is not at all what we found. Our sample had included people that were vaccinated, fully vaccinated 20 days earlier up to almost 200 days earlier. So people with a recent full vaccination, or with a full vaccination that happened more than 6 months earlier. But essentially, there was a distribution of people with low viral load and high viral load that was pretty much the same. On average, irrespective of how long the people have been vaccinated, about 60% of our samples displayed a viral load above the transmissibility threshold, and about 40% below the transmissibility threshold. So in other words, at any time point after vaccination, on average, 60% of the vaccinated people, if infected, would have the chance to have sufficient viral load to transmit the infection, which basically means that the vaccine, albeit giving 100% protection against severe disease, really did not do a good job at all in terms of sterilizing immunity. There was definitely, and there is definitely, a great potential for transmission and ongoing transmission from vaccinated individuals that get infected to the general population, both vaccinated and unvaccinated. We wrote a couple of papers on this, and this epidemic has all continuously been a moving target. Research has been really going at an incredible rate at producing results, producing work, new essays, new drugs, new vaccines, new discoveries. But the virus has been also mutating and going forward itself, and seems always to be a step slightly ahead of us. The two papers here on the vaccine breakthrough cases are currently under review, but in the meantime, the Delta story has become obsolete because by the end of last year, a new variant emerged, and it was the Omicron variant, which kind of changed the scenario. And I will talk about a little bit about that towards the end of the talk. But before continuing with what's happening right now with the Omicron variant, let me tell you about the other work that we've been doing in terms of monitoring in the rest of the Caribbean area. As I said, beyond Florida, we have been also monitoring the situation in Haiti. In Haiti, the situation has been very different than from Florida, despite the geographical proximity. Very early on in the epidemic last year, we found out that Haiti essentially, until January 2021, was almost untouched by the epidemic. There were only a few sporadic cases. There were two waves, one in July 2020 and one in January 2021, but not really many cases in the population. And suddenly, in July 2021, last year, there was a dramatic wave with an exponential spike of infections. This was the time during which the Delta variant was, in fact, spreading in Florida. So we thought that maybe the Delta variant was also spreading in Haiti, but this is not at all what we found. In fact, the Haiti epidemic was completely separated from the Floridian one, and the Haiti cases were in fact caused by the introduction of the Gamma variant, another variant of concern, also known as P1 or Brazilian variant, that was introduced. We don't really know exactly from where, probably from South America, was probably introduced in Haiti around March 2021. This was our phylogenetic reconstruction, and basically within the next few months spread very quickly in the island and caused a pretty dramatic epidemic wave. Haiti has been also, because of this spread of the new Gamma variant, we renewed our effort to continuously monitor in the Asian population, and in doing so, the laboratory of John Lednicki, in collaboration with Dr. Morris and my own group, came across two new interesting animal coronaviruses that really gave us important insight on ongoing zoonoses that are a potential and ongoing threat for our species in terms of continuous introduction of new coronaviruses. The first one was the discovery of a new porcine Delta coronavirus among Asian children. This was published in Nature just a few months ago. And basically, samples was retrieved from 3 children attending 2 different schools in Haiti between 2014 and 2015. So these were all samples that we decided to look back at, or Dr. Lednicki decided to look back at in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, because we thought that suddenly some of the findings might make sense. The children had a febrile illness with some intestinal symptoms. They eventually recovered, so the disease was not deadly, but it was clear that they were infected by a virus that turned out not to be an enterovirus, but in fact was a coronavirus. And after the isolation, we found that it was in fact porcine coronavirus, PD-CoV, and phylogenetic analysis revealed here, this is a phylogenetic tree of known porcine coronavirus. Porcine coronaviruses are Delta coronaviruses that have been known for several years. Currently, there are two major lineages of porcine coronaviruses known. One is mainly circulating in China, the red lineage, and one is mainly circulating in USA, the cyan lineage. And the Asian children, basically, well, the three children, two of them were infected with a coronavirus that was very similar to the coronavirus, the PD-CoV, circulating in Chinese pigs. The other one was infected with a coronavirus strain circulating in USA pigs, in American pigs. So this implies that there were at least two independent, maybe more, zoonotic transmissions from pigs. They happened, we reconstruct the temporal time scale with molecular clock analysis, and they happened at different time points between 2012 and probably 2014. But what was interesting, probably the most interesting feature, was that despite the fact the phylogenetic analysis clearly showed that these were independent evolutionary events and independent zoonotic events, this lineage here comes from a transmission that and this lineage share a common ancestor with a coronavirus circulating in USA, North American pigs. These two viruses share a common ancestor with porcine strains circulating in Chinese pigs, and these are clearly two distinct lineages of coronaviruses. So in spite of the fact that these were independent zoonotic transmission events from two independently evolving lineages of coronaviruses, when we looked actually at the specific mutations accumulated in the spike protein of the human strains, we found a specific signature and specifically specific amino acid residues in the receptor binding domain that were present in the human isolates, and they were identical among the human isolates, and that essentially evolved independently along the human lineage. This is an event of convergent evolution, and convergent evolution usually happens because you have a strong selective pressure, and we hypothesize in the paper that the selective pressure was the ability for these new mutations, the fact that this new mutation possibly provided the ability of to these strains to adapt and replicate in human cells. These strains do replicate in human cells. This was proved by John Lednicki experimentally, and so they clearly evolved in parallel and independently, these mutations, because these mutations were advantageous in terms of adapting to the new host. Now, we have been monitoring, of course, continuously for emergence of new viral strains from the PD-CoV. So far, we haven't found none. This is a good news. But of course, this finding, what it really tells us is, once again, that coronaviruses have the ability to jump the cross-species barrier from their natural host to humans. They have an unusual ability to adapt in the human host. And so what has happened in 2004 with SARS-CoV-2, what has happened with MERS during the 2013 epidemic, what is happening right now with the SARS-CoV-2 are not isolated incidents, but they're in fact part of the coronavirus life cycle and the coronavirus potential of infect our species that we will need to keep monitoring and be aware also for the possibility of future pandemic. And along the same line of thinking, we also isolated, again, Dr. Lednicki's group isolated a novel recombinant canine coronavirus from a visitor to Haiti. And this was, again, another very interesting finding that was published in the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases. A few months last year, a paper was reported a new canine coronavirus coronavirus strain circulating in Malaysian patients that jumped from dogs to humans. And interestingly enough, we found the same event jump from dogs to humans in Haiti a strain that is clearly a canine coronavirus, unrelated from the Malaysian strain, and also recombinant. For the sake of time, I won't go into much details into this, but again, another instance of the fact that coronaviruses, which are widely distributed in many different species, can easily jump to our species, that can easily cross the species barrier and successfully adapt and to replicate into human cells and in the human host. In the meantime, while we were doing all this work, by the end of last year, the Omicron variant emerged. It was detected in South Africa, and the Omicron variant, as everybody knows, because it's been reported everywhere in not just in scientific literature, but all over the newspapers all over the world. Several new different variants. It's an highly hypermutated variant that have a combination of different mutations. The Omicron variant seems to be less infective than the Delta variant, but at the same time, much more infectious. And the result is clear by our continuous monitoring. This is the situation in Florida right now. So as you see here, Delta variant that took over in September, October, November. This is where we were in November. At the beginning of December, the Delta variant was the one that was really representing 99% of the cases. Early December, we have the first case that we detected in Florida of the Delta variant. And then a few weeks later, almost 30% of the new cases detected were in fact Delta variant. Within the next month, the numbers increased exponentially, and by the beginning of January, 100% of the infections were in fact Omicron. And Omicron variant, again, like it happened before for the Delta variant, within 1 month, completely replaced the pre-existing lineage. The same thing happened in Alachua County between December and January. And interestingly enough, in Alachua County, we still have a few cases still today of Delta variant circulating in our county. But again, the overwhelming majority is Delta. The overwhelming majority is Omicron. And still today, Omicron variant is the one that is most represented. We have been tracking Omicron, obviously, with great interest. And we have found that during the past month, the Omicron variant, specifically in Florida and in Alachua, the Omicron cases have been accumulating additional mutation other than the ones canonically described. Some of them, the one here in black, are present in 100% of our Florida isolates, other only in 50% of them. I won't spend too much time in this because the meaning of these mutations in terms of adaptability of the virus, pathogenicity is not really clear yet. It's very much work ongoing, but again, it shows that the virus keep evolving, keep mutating. The Omicron variant is not by all means like the last variant that we will see. And what's happening in Haiti today? Well, right now in Haiti, pretty much is happening what is happening in the rest of the world. The Gamma variant has been the Delta variant eventually was introduced in Haiti in October of last year and basically replaced Gamma by December. And then the Omicron variant arrived in Haiti like in the rest of the world. And our latest surveillance has shown that in January and February, the Omicron variant is now, as in the rest of the world, the most common, the one representing all Asian cases. Why is that? Because the Omicron variant is much more transmissible, and as we know now, the Omicron variant can infect very easily both vaccinated and unvaccinated. Now, if you look at the viral load, which I've been measuring now, and you look at the unvaccinated Omicron, viral load in unvaccinated Omicron infected versus vaccinated Omicron infected, you can see that the unvaccinated Omicron, the unvaccinated infected with the Omicron variant have a viral load that is significantly higher than the unvaccinated ones. You also see that in general, the vaccinated breakthrough cases infected with Omicron, despite there are a few cases that are as high as the one that are vaccinated with Delta, the on average, the median viral load of the vaccinated breakthrough cases with Omicron is around 10 at 6, so 1 million copies, whereas with vaccinated Delta was about 10,000 copies. That's probably one of the reasons why vaccinated vaccine breakthroughs with infected with Omicron tends to transmit the virus more efficiently. And this is also true for unvaccinated Omicron, that tends to have a viral load that on average is higher than unvaccinated Delta. So more infectious and on average a slightly higher viral load that might explain, and also the fact that the virus replicates much more efficiently in the lungs might explain, is one of the factors that might explain why Omicron has been spreading so fast and so quickly throughout the population. To complicate the things, we have been found patients co-infected with Delta and Omicron. On January 7, 2022, there was the first report of a variant combining both Delta and Omicron variant characteristics, the so-called Deltacron, a recombinant between Delta and Omicron. The report has been causing some debate. Some people believe it, some people don't. As a matter of fact, we have found ourselves some evidence of co-infection of Delta and Omicron in our data. However, what we have found in the past 2 months is that the number of Delta and Omicron co-infections, which seem to be spiking at the end of last year, middle of December last year, has been slowing. That has been basically almost completely going down, almost to zero, whereas the number of Omicron-only infection has been reaching almost 100% by the beginning of January. So probably certainly we have found cases of Delta and Omicron co-infection. Probably there has been some cases of recombination, but the fact that eventually Omicron has taken over suggests that even if some recombination between Delta and Omicron has occurred, the Delta Omicron recombinant is not as fit as the Omicron variant alone, because as eventually the co-infection cases have disappeared, the Delta variant has disappeared from the population, and Omicron is really the only one that right now is circulating. So let me finish this very quickly with what we are at right now and what we can expect for the future. The CDC has defined since the very beginning of the epidemic variants of concern as variants that have an evidence of impacting diagnostic treatment of vaccine. In order to define a variant of concern, we have to see that a new variant, a new lineage, has a widespread interference with diagnostic test targets. There must be evidence of substantially decreased susceptibility to one or more class of therapies, evidence of significantly decreased neutralization by antibodies generated during previous infection or vaccination, evidence of reduced vaccine-induced protection, evidence of increased transmissibility, evidence of increased disease severity. These definitions obviously imply that when a new variant occurs, and you have seen, I hope you have now seen through my presentation, how quickly coronavirus can accumulate new mutations, and every new mutation and new combination of mutation potentially can be a new variant of concern. So by the time new mutation appear in the population, to the time that we can really assess whether or not the new mutation is a variant of concern, there will be sometimes weeks, sometimes months in between, because these factors that we need to assess, diagnostic factors, treatment response, vaccine response, increased transmissibility, disease severity, these epidemiological and pathogenic factors that need to be assessed in order to decide whether or not a variant is a variant of concern require time. Just because a new mutation appears, we have no idea whether or not it's going to cause an increased transmissibility or an increased disease severity. And this has caused basically SARS coronavirus 2 to be a moving target, a target that is always 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of us. Every time that a new variant has emerged, by the time we have recognized that variant is a variant of concern, that variant has already spread in a new deadly wave that have swiped around the world. This is really the overall epidemic curve at the global level since the beginning of the epidemic to today. As you can see, in Kent, UK, by the middle of 2020, a new variant, which was called the Alpha variant, was detected. And the Alpha wave occurred just a few months later. Between the time of detection and the time we realized that there was a new wave, there were several months in between. The story repeats itself. The Gamma variant was detected in Amazonas, was discovered in Amazonas just beginning of 2021. The Gamma wave followed a few months later. There was a few months in between before we fully recognized that this new Gamma variant was a much more transmissible variant. Same thing with the Delta wave. It was detected in India much earlier than when the Delta wave occurred, and the South African variant was detected at the end of December, probably circulated already earlier, and only recently the Omicron wave has become the largest wave of the epidemic since the beginning of the epidemic. So, in other words, we have been always one step behind the virus. And the question is, can we find a way to predict when a new variant emerging is a potential variant of concern before the new wave of epidemic becomes? And this is where artificial intelligence algorithms can help. Variants, can we predict variants of concern? Well, we developed an algorithm to do exactly that. We used the enormous wealth of information in the GSA database. We labeled the 1.5 million, data points there as neutral variants, or variants that are basically non-variant of concern and variants of concern. So we had the normal variants and the variants of concern. And then we scanned the database. Let me show you here. Basically, we divided the database in temporal trenches, so month by month. So we use 1 month, the first month of observation starting from 2019, 2020 to train our artificial intelligence algorithm. And then we make a prediction, and we use the month after to see whether our prediction is accurate. And we keep going month after month. The idea is to use the data the month before to predict what's going to happen the month afterwards, and predict whether the particular strains, that emerge at time t are going to be labeled at time t+1 as a variant of concern. There are, of course, a lot of different steps here involved computationally that I'm not going to describe also because I'm running out of time, but the results are so far extremely encouraging. Obviously, at the beginning, our algorithm doesn't work very well because it needs to be trained. At the beginning, there are very few data. But look what happens when we start training our algorithm and we start going from October 2020 on, when in the database there are already a lot of data. So here, the blue line here represent, the specificity and recall. I want you to focus here on the pink line here, which is recall. Recall essentially is the true positive rate, is the true number of variant of concern that our algorithm is correctly able to predict. And as you can see here, essentially going 1 month after the next, starting from November 2020 until today, our algorithm is essentially has a prediction power that is between 95 and 100%. The blue line is the false positive rate, so the error rate, which is so far is not that great. We still have a 30% negative false positive. We are working on to improve this, of course, but it's very encouraging. Essentially, if we look at variant of concern now by lineage, alpha, beta, gamma, epsilon, eta, these are the major ones. We have, for example, for alpha variant of concern, we have a prediction accuracy of 99%, 95%, 98%. What does this mean? Essentially, it means that we can predict exactly 30 days earlier when a new variant of concern is going to, when a new variant is going to be a variant of concern the month after. In other words, if we go to the initial slides here, When a new variant is described in the literature, our algorithm can tell us there is a probability, a high probability that this will be a variant of concern and will spread very quickly in the population and will be more transmissible and more pathogenic 1 month before it becomes a problem. So before it will give rise to the next wave. This is not true just for coronavirus, but our algorithm could be eventually be generalized for future epidemic and for new viruses. So this is the hope for the future. And I need to conclude, and I know I am over time. This obviously was not my work, but the work of a very large team of incredibly committed investigator, several UF faculty that have really worked a lot on this. Most importantly, Mike Luzardo and Glenn Morris here at the PI that have co-lead the project, David Ostroff, Peter Starostik, and Path Labs, Carla Mavian, Brini, John, Mattia, and Simone. Mattia and Simone are our experts in machine learning. UFICBR, the people at UFICBR have been the one really running the actual sequencing. I don't have the time to read all the names, but UF postdoc and students have been doing all the analysis. The Florida Department of Health has been of great support in providing samples and demographic and clinical data. And of course, our collaborators at University of Central Florida, Baycare, and University of Miami. Thank you.
Marco, thank you very much. We are very tight on, we are over time, but given potential interest in this topic, why don't we maybe take a couple of questions and then folks who have questions beyond that can potentially contact you directly. Do we have questions? Dwayne, can you facilitate the...
Let me I see one hand up, so I will allow your microphone now. So you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Hey, Marco, it's Journey. That was
a
wonderful summary of all this amazing work that has been done in such a collaborative sense. The question that I had was actually related to your very last slide of the predictive value of 1 month ahead.
Yes.
And the question that I had around that is so far these variants have kind of come out from other parts of the globe. And I was wondering if when you said it was a 30-day lag period before you could correctly identify if it was going to be a variant of concern and would kind of move through, if you were speaking, it would be a month before it moved through locally in the United States because it came out in another part of the globe, or is this independent of where it originated from? Do you see where I'm trying to go with that?
Right, no. Yes, of course. Thank you. This is a really relevant question. So right now, and just let me say this is at the very, our work on AI is at the very beginning. We have a grant right now that is submitted to NIH. We hope that it will get funded. So at this point, right now, we just did a very initial analysis. What we are doing, we are taking all the sequences in the GSA database, and we do not take into account the geographic component. Okay. So essentially, we look at the sequence, at the genomic variability, we look at the classification of variant of concern, and so the only thing we can say is, okay, this particular sequence with this specific amino acid changes will be classified in 1 month from now as a variant of concern. This means will be a sequence that will have increased transmissibility, will have increased pathogenicity, or will have one of those characteristics that will make it potentially dangerous. So there is no geographic components in terms of it will emerge in this particular area of the world or will spread in this other area of the world. The geographic component can be introduced, of course. This will make the computation much more complex, and it will require refining all the algorithm, and that's definitely one of the direction where we want to go. At the beginning, we wanted just to have a proof of concept, at least to reassure ourselves that this is in principle works, and in principle this works very well because we have a spectacular general prediction here. We can essentially what the algorithms right now does is that it looks at a sequence taken, I don't know, in July 2020, and it tells 30 days from now or 60 days from now, this particular sequence will be classified as a variant of concern. Then you are going to look at what happens 1 month later, and in fact, that sequence appears to be a variant of concern. So clearly captures some characteristics of the genome that makes the sequence either more pathogenic or more transmissible, or a combination of these kind of things. But we hope to extend this in terms also of geographic patterns, spreads, origin, and so forth. This is much more complex, and we hope to do this later.
Okay.
Sorry, and I have to say, the problem right now also with the algorithm is the high level of false positives. Like we have a bunch of variants that get classified potentially as variants of concern, and then they result not to be variants of concern. But this is something we think we can address fairly easily, because right now we are just looking at the amino acid sequence and the amino acid characteristics, but very soon we will add a structural component. A lot of the mutation that we see can be filtered out by looking at where they map in the three-dimensional structure of the protein. So we know, for example, that proteins that don't map in the domain that are involved in receptor binding site, for example, are not very relevant for the infectivity. So if those mutations appear to be in a variant that is classified as variant of concern, they're probably false positive. So there are ways to reduce the number of false positive. But so far, the algorithm captures virtually every single variant of concern that is a real variant of concern. So this is the encouraging part. The true positives are always captured.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for clarifying that, Marco, and a great presentation. Thank you.
One more question, if anyone else has one. Okay.
There were a couple in the chat. Sorry to interrupt you there, Dr. Morris. There were a few in the chat. Can your system assess the rate of emergence and persistence of new mutations as a function of the presence of other mutations that could be used to assess what is behind the emergence of VOC?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This is something actually we are working on it. It's not that easy, but it's definitely, yeah, I don't really have an answer yet, but it's definitely one of the things we are trying to assess. And we think that in fact, our study in Haiti probably will give an answer to that, because Haiti is an ideal place where we see a very clean replacement of different variant of concerns, one after the other. That will give us a good way to measure the fitness of the different variants of concern. And with a measure of fitness, we can go back and look at the impact of different co-occurring mutations and in the emergence of the variants of concern. But I believe that ultimately, in order to answer in depth that question, genomic studies are limited. Ultimately, you need also some experimental observations. You need to do in vitro studies where you do in vitro mutagenesis and look at different combinations of analysis or different combination of mutations to really figure out what is the impact of different mutations on things like viral entry or viral replication. I know that some of these studies are ongoing in other labs. I think it will be ultimately a combination of both genomic studies and in vitro studies.
Dwayne, one more question, then we'll need to close.
All right. Skip down here. Data show both Delta and Omicron can infect vaccinated people, and these latter can still transmit the virus. How about unvaccinated who recover from COVID? Do infectivity and reinfection differ from vaccinated and unvaccinated who never got COVID?
So both Delta and Omicron can infect vaccinated people. Our data show that, in fact, both Delta, we have shown that Delta can be infected, can infect vaccinated people. Vaccinated people, either with Delta or Omicron, can also transmit. What about unvaccinated people? We know that Omicron can infect unvaccinated people faster than Delta. I have read several reports that say that people that are unvaccinated, but they were previously infected, have some measure of protection against Omicron reinfection. but also depends how long ago they were infected. So people that have been infected within the previous 6 months probably are more protected by Omicron reinfection than people that were infected like 1 year ago. Also, however, reports have shown that a person that has been infected and between a person that has been infected and a person that has been vaccinated, the person that has been vaccinated is more protected against reinfection than a person that has been infected. So vaccine provides more protection against reinfection rather than natural infection. I think that there are several reports now that have shown that this is pretty clear. So yes, if you are have been infected in the past, this will provide some measure of protection against reinfection, although Omicron is highly infectious, and if you have been infected more than 6 months ago, I think there is still a pretty high chance that you will get reinfected if you get exposed. People that are vaccinated, that have been vaccinated, I think have a better chance to be protected against infection than the unvaccinated ones. However, I think this is important to keep in mind. To some extent, the conversation is academic, because ultimately we have to keep in mind the important crucial point here, that if you're not vaccinated and you get infected, there is a certain risk that you are going to have a severe disease or even die. And if you're vaccinated, you can get infected, and Omicron variants, we can see this, can infect vaccinated people, not as easily as unvaccinated people, but can certainly infect vaccinated people more easily than Delta variants used to infect vaccinated people. However, if you're vaccinated and you get infected by Omicron or Delta or other variants, 80% of the time you will have no symptoms, and 15-20% of the time you will have very mild symptoms. And there are just very few instances in which you will have severe symptoms if you're vaccinated. So at the end of the day, the vaccine does not provide sterilizing immunity. If you're vaccinated, there is still a chance that you're going to get infected. However, the vaccine does provide a really strong protection against all variants that have been in circulation, including the current variant. And I think this is what we have to keep reminding people, that vaccination is an effective weapon against the continuous spread of the illness, not necessarily of the virus, but is a weapon against the spread of the illness.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Marco, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. Again, I would say on behalf of EPI, we thank everybody for your attendance today. It's been a great day. If you haven't already, please go take a look at the poster sessions. They're still up and will be for a while. Really some outstanding science, and we really thank everybody who took part in our activities today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Goodbye.